Hi guys, welcome to CodeDIY. In this tutorial, I'm going to be teaching you about webhooks and how to build your webhooks with AWS Lambda and FastAPI. A webhook is basically an HTTP request that is triggered by an event. So it's just like you trying to post an event to your server over the web through an API. So Lambda is going to be the one sending our request this time around. So to get started, you need to create a virtual environment and install certain dependencies. So I have my dependencies here in my requirements.txt. You need to install, I'd say FastAPI. You need to install UVCon and you need to pip install request. So once you have all those three, you're good to go. So if you're new to webhooks, you might need to check out another tutorial or maybe a resource material basically telling you how webhooks work and what they are. So let's get started. I'm going to create a file called main.py. And the first thing I'll need to do is I'm going to need to import the necessary files, or rather the necessary libraries I'm going to be needing. So I'm going to say from FastAPI, import FastAPI. And I'm also going to be importing HTTP exception, also requests and background task. Then I'm going to need to import, I would say base model from Pydantic. And to do that, I'm going to say from, Pydantic import base model. Then I'm going to need to import requests and import UVCon. Okay, UVCon. I think I spelled that correctly. Or okay, UVCon. Then why isn't that yellow? Okay, I'll need to change this to use my virtual environment. And I believe that's going to be highlighted to yellow soon. So first, I'll need to create my first API endpoint that basically sends a webhook event. So I'll say at app.post. So I'm going to be stimulating a fintech environment or maybe someone trying to make a payment in this situation. Okay, I seem to have done app.post here without initializing my FastAPI application. So let's do that. I'm going to say app equals FastAPI. So with this, I have initialized my FastAPI application rather. So I'm creating a new endpoint called payments. So we know how payment works. We basically create an endpoint that basically makes payment. So I'll say def payment event. Then payment event is going to be receiving a payment event. So this can be a dictionary. So rather than having this being a dictionary, I'm just going to define a schema here with Pydantic of what my payment event should look like. So I can say class payment event, right? And I would need to pass in base model. Then amount, which is going to be a float. I also going to need to describe the description, which is going to be a string. Then lastly, I'm going to say webhook underscore URL, which is going to be a string. So this webhook URL is going to be a field, which is going to be the URL that's going to be receiving the webhook event. Now, in a standard application or in industry practice, you're not necessarily going to be passing your webhook underscore URL or your webhook URL rather through a payload like this. Instead, it's going to be saved somewhere else, maybe the database or something. So it's not standard practice that you're going to be passing your webhook URL through a payload. I'm just passing this here because I'm trying to stimulate an actual event, or rather, I'm trying to give you an idea of what a webhook is and how it works. So if you're kind of watching this to kind of build a webhook event at your organization or your work, don't pass this through a payload. Let it be a field that's going to be saved somewhere, and inside your function calls here, you're going to call that field request for it by making a database request or something, then get the webhook URL, then you can move forward. It's not going to be passed through a payload. So thank you. Now, I'm going to need to pass in the payment event as a type here. So once my payment event is kind of complete, I would then need to maybe return a status code that basically says, okay, that will be return I'm going to return a dictionary that's basically status. That will be 200. Then I'm going to be returning data, which is going to be payment event dot underscore underscore date. So I kind of want to return the payment event back. Now, one thing I can kind of like do is I can kind of then make some check or something and check that, okay, if payment underscore event dot amount, rather I would say if not payment underscore event dot amount, I'm going to say raise an HTTP exception that basically says I would say status, sorry, that's supposed to be the status code. So status code 400, and I can decide to pass in the error message, which is going to be detail, that which says amounts can't be blank. Good. I guess we can move forward now. Now, while we kind of have this, we're trying to check if our amount is basically equal to a value. Otherwise, we're going to try an HTTP exception. Now, how is a web going to be working? We want to do this. If someone makes a payment event, we want to trigger a webhook, or not necessarily trigger a webhook. We want to basically check if someone, okay, sorry. So if someone makes a payment, we want to check if the payment is verified or valid. So to do that, you can be doing that somewhere on Lambda that basically checks if the payment is valid. So you might not necessarily want an operation like that to be on your server, which is one of the reasons for webhook. And once your operation is valid, your Lambda function then sends an event to your server telling it that it can verify, it can mark that transaction as valid. So let me kind of like try to build what I'm trying to say right now. Okay, so I'm going to create an extra function that says def send webhook, right? So what this function is going to do is this. It's going to receive a payload. I can give the payload a type of maybe I can give this a dictionary, right? Then I'm going to need to have this endpoints make a request. It's then going to go this way, try, and it will say request dot post. It's going to pass this to a URL, which is not ready yet, and I'm going to have a JSON equals to payload. Good. Otherwise, I'm going to be raising an exception here. So that'll be except I think there's a request exception. So I think that'll be request dot exceptions dot request exception. Yes. So I think I can print out the exception instead as E. I'm gonna say print E. Good. So once we have print E, we can decide to raise this exception if we want. So accept request exception equals to this. So this is going to be responsible, this function here is going to be responsible for sending our payload here to AWS Lambda. Now, AWS Lambda is going to verify if this payment is correct. And once that payment is kind of correct, or rather, once that payment is kind of verified as valid, it then kind of sends a webhook event saying, okay, this was a successful payment. You can save this in your database as a transaction that's been processed. So now, once we kind of have this, we then send this payload to this function here. So to do that, I can then say send underscore webhook, and I can call this and I can pass a dictionary to it. So to pass my dictionary, I can pass this and say amount, right, equals to amount, equals to payment underscore event or amount, or I can say description. If I want to pass in the description, payment underscore event dot description, or rather I could pass in, or the webhook URL instead. So I'll say webhook underscore URL. It's going to be webhook, payment underscore event dot webhook underscore URL. So this is what it's going to look like. Now let's try and pay attention to something here. If we take a look at this code here, we can see we receive our payment event here, or rather our payment payload. And once it's a verified amount, we then send a webhook. But one thing we need to realize is that this code is kind of interpreted line by line. And before this function completes execution, the send webhook function has to finish running first. So I don't kind of want that. I want the send webhook function to be a background task. So if it's a background task, it can just run in the background and not necessarily delay our payment process from being completed. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a background task to this route here. So I'm going to say background underscore task. Then I'm going to need to pass in background task. So I'm going to then cut out this here. Then I'm going to say, background underscore task. Then I'll need to add this task dot add task. I'll pass in the name of the function, which is send underscore webhook, right? Then I would need to pass in the arguments to this function, which is basically a dictionary. So once I kind of pass this, we then have our code ready. So I'm going to format this to just look proper. Yes, so this is what it's going to look like. Lastly, I'm then going to add one more endpoint, which is going to be a post. So I'm going to say app.post. I'll define the route as webhook, rather, with okay, sorry, this should start with a /. So I'm going to define a function under this called def receive webhook underscore events. So this is going to be responsible for receiving a webhook event, and it's going to receive a request. So once it requires a request, we need to get the contents of the request and print it out. So that'll be data equals requests, right? .json. Then I'm going to need to return I would say message webhook received. So data equals to request.json. Now calling request.json is asynchronous, so I'm going to need to say async. Then I'm going to need to await this. Good. So this is kind of how we have our code now. So just a quick explanation again, we kind of have payment events. This endpoint stimulates an actual payment. So it's just like you're trying to make a payment, and in the process of making that payment, this function called send webhook is called, which is going to make an HTTP push request to a URL here. And this URL is going to be connected to our Lambda function. Our Lambda function is going to do some processes and check if this payment is actually valid. It's kind of like verifies the payment. And once it does that, a Lambda function will then send a request here to this, which is going to be a webhook. So that's how the entire system is actually going to work. So now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to need to start my server. I'm going to say if name equals underscore main underscore. Then I can say ubcon.run, right? I'll need to pass in my app. I'll need to pass in my host. So that'll be host, right? Equals 0.0.0.0. And I'll need to also pass in my port, which is going to be equals to 8080, or rather, I think I should use 4040. I believe a process could be running on port 8080. So now that I kind of have that now, I can decide to test my application by saying, I'm going to clear this out by saying python main.py. So if I have a mistake somewhere, I believe I'm going to get an error. Okay, so I do not have a mistake, so I'm going to just go back here. I'm going to say localhost 4040/docs. Okay, as you can see, my endpoints are appearing here. Now, also, I'm going to need to show you something as an example, but let's move forward before doing that. So while this is running, I'm just going to shut this down now. The next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to create my Lambda function. So one way to go about this is I go to the AWS Lambda, I create a function, I write my function name, I get started and start writing code and all and testing through the dashboard. But I'm not going to be doing that this time around. I'm going to be making use of AWS SAM, which is going to help me to kind of like test my Lambda function. SAM is basically an open source framework designed for building serverless application. So it basically streamlines the process of creating, testing, and deploying your Lambda functions for you. So you can decide to search for AWS SAM, and this is going to bring up AWS SAM serverless application model here, and you can get started. You're going to see some resources, and you will need to install the SAM CLI to get started. So I'm not necessarily going to be going over how to install the SAM CLI. So I'm going to leave that to you. You can just search the way I did and you will install SAM CLI by yourself. You'd also need to install the AWS Management Console. So that's how it goes. I assume that's a lot of information, but I'm assuming also that this video is not really for beginners, but people that kind of have understanding of how Lambda function works also. So let's get started. So the first thing you need to do is run a command called sam-init. So sam-init basically initialize your serverless application for you. It asks you which templates to choose. I'm going to choose number 1. So I'm going to just expand this for visibility. So after choosing number 1, it's going to give me a couple of templates to choose from. I'm going to choose the simplest one, which is the hello world. So it says use the most popular runtime and package type. I'm going to say no. So when you're trying to choose a runtime, I would always recommend you use the Python runtime that is basically running on your computer. So I'm using Python 3.10. So I'm going to say 18. So I'm going to use what package type would like to use. I'm going to use zip. So would you like to enable X-ray tracing? Yeah. And project name, I'm going to call it hooks. Hooks, since it's a webhook. Okay, so as you can see, we have a folder here called hooks, which is going to help us in kind of like testing our Lambda function. So I'm going to say cd hooks. Cd hooks. So I'm going to be inside this folder now. So as you can see, Sam has basically created different files for us. As you can see, there's an hello world folder here called app.py, and it has something called def lambda handler. So this def lambda handler that is kind of here is going to be responsible for our Lambda function. This is the function that's going to be called every time we kind of like trigger our Lambda function. So we also have our template or YAML, which kind of is like a CloudFormation template for a serverless application. It basically has an event, which is an API event. So our Lambda function is going to be triggered by an API event, which you have here. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this here. I'm going to then modify it to be a post, since it's going to be a post request. And I'm also going to modify the URL path to be called hooks. So our Lambda function is now going to be triggered by a post event with something called /hooks. Lastly, I'm going to need to also modify this to use hooks, which is going to be our API URL. And also there's a particular field here called timeout. So this timeout is kind of like how long it takes for my Lambda function to execute. I'm going to change that to 10 seconds. Okay, so in case you kind of like see me kind of like change stuff here and you're new to AWS SAM, I would recommend you watching a video that I kind of have on my channel that basically tells you how to build thumbnails from a video using AWS SAM and AWS Lambda and S3. So I kind of go deeper into how this works. So no, I'm just trying to not focus on this right now. The end goal is webhooks. So this is what I'm trying to focus on right now. So since I have all this modified, I'm going to save this. And I also have a file here called events.json, which is what I'm going to use to kind of like test my events. So now I'm going to go back to my app.py with under my function called lambda underscore handler. I'm going to uncomment request. Then I would need to write my lambda function here. So there is something I'm going to do now. I'm going to be creating I'm going to be modifying this event.json here, because this event.json is going to be what's passed here. So basically event.json, everything here is basically what's the same as this. So if I do something that's like print events body, this right here is what I'm going to be printing. So this event.json here is basically going to be stimulating our payments payload and what our payment payload kind of like looks like. So in our situation, we're kind of expecting a payment payload of I would say of the amount and possibly the webhook URL. So I'm going to say I'm going to comment this out. Right? Okay, I'm going to be removing this also. And this and this. Good. So I'm going to say message hello world. I'm also going to be passing in amount. Sorry. I'm going to be passing amounts. So let's say I bought something of 200, or rather $2,000. Then I'm going to need to pass in the webhook underscore URL. Okay, so let me do a little bit of explaining. So if I go back to my main.py here, we can see that we're kind of like sending a payload here. This payload here is what we're going to be sending to our Lambda function. So I'm trying to, once I kind of like send this payload here, it's what I'm trying to create here. So amount, webhook URL here, and lastly, a description. So a description is going to be something like payments made. So I guess that's valid, a valid JSON. Or am I making a mistake somewhere? Okay, I seem to be making a mistake somewhere. Okay, where else could I be making a mistake now, since everything here seems to be red? Amounts, payment made. Okay, I don't need this. Good. So we have I would say okay, I would say we have a valid JSON now. So I'm trying to stimulate what my body is going to look like. It's going to contain a message, amount, webhook URL, and a description. So which is similar to basically what we have here, an amount, a description, and a webhook URL. So this event.json here is what we're going to be using to test this lambda underscore handler locally. So to kind of like test if this is actually valid, I can decide to do something called sam build, right? Once I run sam build, this is going to build my lambda function and create the necessary things that needs to be created for this to work. So I can then say sam, right? I can then say sam local. Then I would say invoke, and I'll call hello world function. In case you're asking where I got the name hello world function here, if you refer to this, you can see that the name of our serverless function is defined as hello world function. So that's the name I'm kind of like using here. Then I'll pass in an event argument, which is going to receive event / event.json. So once I run this is going to kind of like run my lambda underscore handler. Sorry, it's going to run this function here, and it's going to print out my events.body. So I'm just going to move this up a bit, and we're just going to wait for this to execute. It's not supposed to take this long. It usually doesn't take this long. All right, so it seems like my lambda function kind of like timed out, and it says unique HTTP connection host equals localhost So something probably kind of like failed. So I'm going to run this again. Okay, so I kind of have an idea of how as to why my Lambda function seems to be failing. So before running this, I would also need to run some build again. So, and once I kind of run this, then I'm going to say some local info hello world events are JSON. And yes, it's, I guess my Lambda function is running as it should now. Okay, as you can see, this return a status here, a body, and a message, and it did not return my event.body. That it could probably be because I did not save my event.body. But if I run some build again, sorry, if I run some build, okay, then I run some local invoke. This is going to print my events.body, which is going to be the same as what I kind of have here. So yes, as you can see, this is what my body looks like. So with that, we can then proceed to kind of creating our Lambda function that kind of like test what we're trying to do. So now I'm going to need to say body equals events, right? In body. So we're basically taking this. Now I'm going to try and create a system that kind of like verifies our payments. So I'm going to say for payments to be verified, we need the amounts being paid greater than $100. So I'm going to say if body amounts, right, less than 100, I'm going to say response bracket event, sorry, square bracket event equals I would say payment underscore field. Now this is probably I would say this, sorry, equals, I would say this is probably underlined because I've not defined what response should look like. Response is going to be a dictionary. So I'm going to say payment field if my amount is less than 100. So I can say response message equals I would say a payment error occurred. Otherwise, I would need to say else. I would say otherwise you kind of like have a successful payment. So I can say S, but I can call this payment verified, and I can say the payment was verified. Now that we kind of have this, we'll need to then make an HTTP request back to our server. So I can say I can write this in a try and accepts here. So I can say requests dot post, right? I'll say request dot post, that'll be events, right? Sorry, I'm gonna say body equals to webhook underscore URL, and the payload is gonna be a JSON, right? So I'm gonna be saying JSON equals to response, and headers equals to content hyphen type and application / JSON. Good. So now that I kind of have this here, this is going to make an HTTP request to my webhook URL. Except otherwise, I would say I'm probably just going to raise this exception here. So once this request has been made, okay, sorry, I didn't unuse properly. I'll say requests dot exceptions dot request exception as E. good. So otherwise, I'm going to take this. Sorry, I'm going to take this here. And okay, something seems to be wrong. Okay, good. I'm going to take this here and I'll paste this here. So what this is going to do is it's going to check my amount and check if it's less than 100 and response.event if it's equals to payment underscore failed, it's going to work. Otherwise, if it's payment underscore failed, it's going to return an error. And if it's payment underscore verified, it's going to say the payment was verified. So that'll be request stop post book webhook URL response header content underscore type application /JSON status code 200 body equals json.docs and all. So not to waste our time, I'm just going to run this. Now let's take note of something. If I run this here, it's going to fail because my webhook URL is empty. So normally my webhook URL is supposed to be something like localhost 4000 /webhook, because that's that's basically what we kind of have here. So I need to run localhost 4000 /webhook, but we need to kind of like take note that our Lambda function cannot make requests to our local machine. You can make a request from your Lambda function you can make requests for your Lambda function which is on the cloud to your local machine, which is basically local. So it's I'm sure we all understand how networking works. So instead, I'm going to run this command and I'm going to create some, and I'm going to do something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a reverse proxy called ngrok. So I'm going to say ngrok http 4000. So what ngrok is going to do is, in case you don't know what ngrok is, I would recommend you going to their site. So if you type ngrok here, you're going to see it here, and ngrok /download. So you can say the fast way to put anything on the internet. So you can kind of like test what's local via you can test what's local via ngrok. So what that means is that I'm basically forwarding requests via an ngrok http to my local server. So let me give you an understanding of what I mean. Sorry, this is running on http 4000, but I want it to be 4040 because that's my port. So I'm going to say ngrok http 4040. So this is going to give me a URL https here, and once I kind of like copy this here, as you can see, this localhost 4040 docs, if I say this URL and I put /docs here, perfect, you can see that my FastAPI application is loading as if I actually kind of like deployed it. So I'm then going to need to go to my event.json here and paste this here. Now that I pasted my webhook URL here, so this is going to send a request to this here. Now, since I'm going to need to be testing this, I'm just going to remove this part of my application. Sorry. Okay, I do not need to remove this part. So I'm going to just be testing my Lambda function. Sorry. So I'm going to run my Lambda function back now. So if this kind of executes successfully, it means that I should be expecting a post request in my logs here. So I'm going to say SAM build. That's build my serverless application. Then I'm going to run SAM local invoke. So if I do get errors, it means something went wrong. Otherwise, it means everything was successful. So let's wait and see what SAM has to tell us. Okay, so it said type error, request error message not supported, type error, request ID, start trace, if body amounts. Okay, let me see app.py. So I think this might have to do with the way this is coming in. It says what? Lambda and lots of string and int. Sorry, I'll need to debug. Okay, I see. So I'm passing in my amount as a string, so it's supposed to be a number, not a string. So I'm gonna go back to my template.yaml. So since I'm modifying my event.json, I don't need to rebuild my application. It's when I make a change to my app.py, my Lambda script or my Lambda template, I would need to rebuild. So I'm just gonna run this now, and I think this should work. So please work, please work, please. Okay, it's still invoking, and okay, so this was successful. So if I go back here, it says post HTTP 1.1 404 not found. That means I made a mistake here. Yes, so this should be /webhook, because if I go to main.py, that's what I kind of have here. So I'm going to save this event.json here again, and to kind of like verify that it works, I'm going to then say sam local invoke. So that's running now. Great. So that worked. So if I go back here, as you can see, there is a push request here, which is a sign that I successfully received the webhook event. So the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to deploy what we've built. So to kind of do that, I'm just going to clear this out now. So to deploy a Lambda function is quite simple. You just need to run a single command, which is sam deploy --- guided. Okay, so it says template file not found, blah 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 blah. Okay, sorry, I guess I was in the wrong directory. Okay, this is where I should be. So I'm going to clear this out. So I'm going to say sam deploy --- guided, and this is going to give me a comprehensive step of how to deploy my Lambda function. So it's going to say what's the name of my stack. The name of my stack is going to be hooks. My region EU01, that's Stockholm. So confirm changes before deploy, yes. And it's going to say role creation, yes. So it's going to say disable rollback, well, yes. Most times that should be no, because you might need to roll back in case you have problems. So hello function may not have authorization defined. Is this okay? Yes. So I'm not showing you how to kind of authorize your Lambda function with API gateway now. So we're just going to like skip this. So some configuration environment the default. So it's going to start looking for resources to actually kind of deploy this, and it's going to start. Now, when you're at the point of deploying, this is going to upload everything you want. Then it's going to ask you a question if you're going to accept the change sets to be created. So you need to wait a bit, and yes, deploy this change set, yes. Once you press yes, this is going to deploy everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to like wait for a few seconds and wait for the entire operation to be complete. All right, as we can see, our Lambda function is done deploying. So I'm just going to go back here. I'm going to run my Python application, python main.py. Good. So to kind of like be certain that our Lambda function is deployed, I'm going to reload this. Perfect. As you can see, my Lambda function called hooks has already been deployed to AWS Lambda, and a trigger has been attached to this, and this trigger is an API gateway endpoint. So this is how my Lambda function is going to be called and accessed. It means through API gateway, I make a request to my Lambda, I make a request to API gateway passes that to my Lambda function, and my Lambda function is kind of triggered. As you can see, I have my code here. So I'm going to click on this, and as you can see, I have an API endpoint here. This API endpoint here is going to be what I'm going to use to trigger this webhook. So like I said, this webhook is going to be it's going to be receiving a post event. So I'm going to need to go back to my main.py here, and I'll go on the request.post, and I'll paste this here. So it says try request.post. So make a request.post here and pass in this JSON payload. And this JSON payload is going to contain my amount, my description, and my webhook URL. So I'm going to save this now. So with this, okay, sorry, I might need to reload my application now. So with this, I can kind of like have a webhook event that actually works. So the entire flow works this way. I make a payment, and a background task is run that basically sends a webhook, And once this webhook is, that basically sends an event, not a webhook. I'm just calling this send, or okay, to avoid confusions, I'm just going to rename this to be send events. So this is going to send the payload of my payment event here. And once it kind of sends this here, my Lambda function kind of receives it here. It then processes it by checking if the amount is less than 100. If it's less than 100, it basically returns a response that says it's an error. Otherwise, it basically verifies my payment as valid. So now what we're going to do is we're going to test this now that it works. So to do this, I'm going to do this with my ngrok URL here. So I'm going to need to copy this here. Okay, that's already opened. I'm going to reload. Okay, good. So I'm going to create a payment. So I'm going to try this out. So I'm going to pass in an amount that's probably $4,000. A description should be payments made. So my webhook URL is going to be this. If we recall, my webhook URL is the URL that is going to be receiving a webhook event from Lambda. Now, your webhook URL is not usually passed as a payload. Please take note of this. This is usually saved somewhere on the database. So it's not something that's supposed to be passed as a payload. So in case you're watching this video to kind of build a feature for your organization, this is not supposed to be used as a payload. You're basically going to be saving it somewhere that is more secure. Probably you make a database request. You make a query rather to your database to access this. So I'm going to say / webhook, right? I guess that's the name of the URL. Okay, since I've kind of like done that, I can then execute. Okay, as you can see, I basically have a payment made. So if I go back, I'm expecting to see a push request because a webhook event should have been triggered. Okay, so apparently a webhook event was not triggered, and okay, this should be the reason because I forgot to rename this here. So an error must have occurred. So my background task must have failed. So I'm gonna reload this and I'm gonna retry this again. I'll just copy the payload. I'll need to reload the entire page again since I'm using ngrok. Right? So go back, try it out. Okay, paste, execute, and I guess that's done. Yes, as you can see, okay, my webhook event has not still been received. That's quite interesting. So to kind of just like get an idea of what went wrong, the best way would probably be to go to my Lambda function. I mean, I passed this correctly. Okay, would be to go back to my Lambda function here and here. So one thing I can do is to debug this, I can go to monitoring. Here, monitoring is going to be able to tell me if I made a mistake or not. So this. And if an exception occurred, I believe we raised that exception. So now when you kind of are trying to when you're trying to debug your CloudWatch logs, so when you're trying to debug your Lambda function, you need to go under monitoring to kind of find the logs. So in some situations, the logs are not usually updated immediately. Actually, most times they're not usually updated immediately, so you kind of need to be refreshing continuously till you kind of get the logs. Okay, since Lambda is not giving us the logs, let's also go to I think the best would also, I think we can also go to API gateway here. And API gateway is going to give us an idea of our endpoints. So yes. So to test if this works, we can also kind of like test this through API gateway and actions, posts. Then I can pass in my request or body and say test. So let's see. Okay, is there error type string indices must be integers? endpoint unhandled. Endpoint response error message string indices must be integers. Error type star creates lambda under. So if body amount. So the problem has to be with the value I'm passing. It says string indices must be integers. So string indices must be integers. Error type 5. If body amount. So it says that there is something wrong with the data I'm passing, but apparently I don't seem to find anything wrong with the data I'm passing here. Okay, just to debug this quick, I'm just gonna pause the video and just find out what's wrong and get back. Okay, so I have a fix in mind. So I'm just gonna go back here to my app.py. So it seems body amount is being interpreted as a string. So normally I would want to kind of like verify that this works well, but just for a quick fix, I'm going to be typecasting this to an integer. So then I'm going to rebuild this and redeploy this to be sure this works as it should. So rather than say SAM deploy guided this time around, I'm just going to deploy with SAM. So everything is kind of done automatically. Then I move back to testing my Lambda function. Okay, now that my deployment is done, I'm just going to go back here and I'm going to reload. And then I'm going to go to code just to ensure that my change is completely reflected. Okay, so the typecasting is done. So then I'm going to need to go back and make my payment request again. Then I'm going to need to reload this here. So if I say I'm going to go here, try it out, and good. So yeah, so I'm going to execute this now. So I guess that worked. So I'm going to go here. It seems something seems to be wrong with this again. So one way to ensure this works is I'm going to test this again, and okay, let's reload this page. Test, and okay, so what's the error message we kind of have right now? It says, what's the error message? It says string indices must be integer, type error, request if int body amount. Okay, string indices must be integer. I'm sorry, I kind of get where the error is coming from. So it's very possible that this event that is being passed here is basically a JSON string rather than a pure JSON. So I'm going to say JSON.loads, right? I'm going to say JSON.loads events body. So right, I will say JSON.loads event. Then I would need to pass in body. So I think that's a suitable approach. Or okay, sorry. I would say the event body itself should be the JSON string actually. So JSON event body is going to be a JSON string. So because prior to the time I kind of like open event.json, this JSON was wrapped in a string here. So I'm just going to redeploy this. And once I've redeployed this, so I'm going to say SAM build, then SAM deploy. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video, and once this done, I'm just going to resume the video and go back to testing my webhooks. All right, now that my deployment is done, I'm just going to go back here, and I think my server is still running. So what I'm going to do is this: I'm going to copy my payload that I'm trying to use to test, and I'm going to go back to API. Sorry, I'm going to go to my Swagger docs here and reload this. Then I'm going to receive my webhook event. I'll try this out. Sorry, payment event. I'm going to try this out and execute. Okay, so that worked. And yes, as you can see, we kind of have our push request here. So this is more like a clear explanation that our webhook works. Just to kind of be sure that we're receiving accurate data, what I can do is I can go to my main.py and I'll print the data that is being returned by our Lambda function here. So because it means this code is getting executed the way it's supposed to be executed now. So I'm going to say, I'm going to start this, then I'm going to go back to Swagger again. So, oh, sorry, that should be /docs. So then save, Control V, then execute. So yes, that worked. So as you can see, it's giving us a message that says events verified, the payment was verified. So in a situation where we kind of want the payments to fail, I can change the amount to 40 and execute this again. So that worked, and as you can see, payment failed. So this is an evidence that our webhook kind of works. So I can decide to go under monitoring, and if I go under monitoring, I'm going to get the logs of everything that kind of works. So that is how you kind of build a webhook with FastAPI. So I really have to apologize that we had problems when we're trying to test this. I mean, that's part of software. That's basically part of software development process. You have bugs, you have things you need to fix and all. So I'll try and do better next time to not have errors such as this. And I hope you still enjoy the video. So if you kind of still want more clarity, I'm going to be pasting a link to this article. I created an article for this video, so you can also check that out to kind of have a clear idea of what we're trying to do. So thank you for joining me today, guys. Bye.